Hello, you beautiful lot, and welcome back. It's been a minute. I'm armed with a good cup of coffee, and we're ready to start our next season of The Observing Eye, where we're going to be looking at the realm of the psychonauts. So, first episode that we're going to roll into today is Timothy Leary. So, hopefully, you'll enjoy it. I also want to take a little moment to give some gratitude to all of you. We've got a load of new people signed up on the Substack and on the YouTube. And we've had a load of comments over the past few weeks that have been really interesting to read and really great to hear your feedback. So thank you to everyone who's signed up, who's paying attention, who's engaging, and who's given me some food for thought. So yeah, deeply appreciate all of that. You know, I always appreciate your presence and your time, as I say at the end of the episodes. I guess that's it from me, really. Just want to have a little hi. Say a little hi to all of you before I start. So let's get into this one, shall we? First episode of The Realm of the Psychonauts with Timothy Leary. We like to imagine that freedom arrives as a breakthrough, a moment, a revelation, a door blown open in the mind. We tell ourselves that if we could just see differently, feel differently, step outside the ordinary machinery of thought for long enough, then perhaps the whole weight of being human would rearrange itself. The fear would loosen. The confusion would soften. The walls between us and the world might become a little less solid. And for a certain kind of person, that promise does not just feel attractive, it feels sacred. Timothy Leary lived inside that promise, but he also lived inside its shadow. Because this is not simply the story of a man who challenged convention, or a man who championed psychedelics, or a man who became one of the most recognizable faces of the counterculture. It is also the story of what happens when the search for liberation becomes entangled with performance, what happens when insight starts to blur into ego, what happens when a genuine question about consciousness becomes a cultural spectacle. And that, I think, is why Leary is so important. Not because he was right about everything, because he certainly wasn't. And not because he was merely wrong either. That would make things too easy. He matters because he stood at the fault line that still runs through modern life. The tension between awakening and escape. Between transformation and theatre. Between wanting to know the mind more deeply and wanting perhaps to outrun the burden of having one at all. There's something deeply human in that temptation. Most of us will never become symbols of an era. We will not end up on magazine covers as prophets of altered consciousness. We won't become shorthand for a cultural revolution. But many of us do know what it is to hunger for an experience that will change everything. A book that will finally explain us. A spiritual practice that will dissolve our suffering. A relationship that will heal the old wound. A moment so intense, so total, that we can step out of ourselves and return remade. Sometimes that hunger opens something real, but sometimes it's just a trap. And Leary, more than most, seems to embody both possibilities at once. He was a psychologist, a provocateur, a cultural icon, a salesman of transcendence, and depending on who you ask, either a visionary or a vandal. A man who helped drag the question of consciousness into public view, and a man who may also have helped turn that question into a slogan. That's the difficulty with figures like this. They don't sit still. The closer you look, the less tidy they become. Which is why this episode isn't really about deciding whether Timothy Leary was a hero or a fraud. It's about something more uncomfortable than that. It's about our relationship with altered states, with rebellion, with meaning, and with the fantasy that there might be a shortcut through the hard, slow work of becoming a person. Because even now, long after the slogans of the 1960s have faded into the cultural wallpaper, the same longing is still with us. We still want transcendence. We still want release. We still want to believe that one ordinary experience might save us from the ordinary fact of ourselves. So this is where we begin. With a man who promised expansion and with a culture that wanted very badly to believe him. And with the uneasy question waiting underneath it all. What if the search for freedom can become its own kind of prison? Most people do not become who they are all at once. They become themselves in layers, through training, through grief, through ambition, through accident. A life gathers its shape slowly, and then sometimes, with almost no warning at all, one experience arrives and seems to split that life into a before and an after. Timothy Leary's life has one of those moments, but before we get there, before the slogans and the scandal and the mythology, it's worth pausing on the man as he first appears. He didn't enter public life as a wandering mystic or a cultural revolutionary. He entered it as a psychologist, a man shaped at least initially by institutions, research, and the modern belief that the mind could be studied, measured, and perhaps understood. He was born on October 22, 1920 in Springfield, Massachusetts. Later earned his PhD in psychology from the University of California, Berkeley, and by 1959 had arrived at Harvard as a lecturer in psychology. Now this is important because if we begin the story too late, we miss the tension already there at the start. Leary was not an outsider kicking at the doors of the academy. He came through those doors. He belonged there, at least on paper. His early work was not yet the work of a psychedelic icon. Harvard's own psychology history notes that his early research focused on personality, social relationships, and psychotherapy. In other words, he began within the accepted language of 20th century psychology, not outside it. And yet there's often a strange fragility in respectable knowledge. It can feel complete right up until the moment someone touches a frontier it can't yet contain. For Leary, that frontier appears in 1960. That summer, while in Cuernavaca, Mexico, I think that's how you pronounce it. You know what I'm like trying to pronounce things? He tried psilocybin mushrooms, those happy magic mushrooms. By his own later account, the experience altered the direction of his life. The details of psychedelic conversion stories can sometimes sound grandiose, almost suspiciously cinematic, but this one matters because of what it did next. Leary didn't return from Mexico as a poet or a prophet. This is no Carlos Castaneda. He returned to Harvard, back to the university with a new conviction that psychology had barely begun to understand the range and plasticity of consciousness. Now, this is the first important thing to grasp. At the beginning, this didn't necessarily look absurd. It looked to some like a legitimate extension of inquiry. Harvard's Department of Psychology still frames that early moment in revealing terms. In 1960, Leary and Richard Alpert, who you may recognize, but I'm going to save his name for later, they began exploring the effects of psychotropic substances on the human mind, because as they saw it, psychology studies the mind, including its relationship to brain, body, and environment. That's not the language of carnival, it's the language of research. It carries the confidence of a discipline that believes new methods might open new understanding. And Richard Alpert matters here too. Later, the world would know him as Baba Ram Das, with all the spiritual resonance that name now carries. But at this stage, he's just another Harvard psychologist, another intelligent man operating within the same institutional world. Together, Leary and Alpert launched what became known as the Harvard Psilocybin Project, which ran from 1960 to 1962. Their aim was to document psilocybin's effects on human consciousness through volunteer subjects and real-time reports of their experiences. From a certain angle, it looked bold and modern and maybe even necessary, but from another, the trouble was already beginning. Now, this is where we have to take the atmosphere of the early 1960s into account. Psychedelics had not yet fully settled into the public imagination as symbols of chaos, counterculture, and social collapse. Thank you, Richard Nixon. At that point, they still occupied a stranger, more unsettled territory. They could be imagined as therapeutic tools, as instruments of consciousness research, as possible doorways into mystical or religious experience. Even now, when Harvard writes about the renewed interest in psychedelic therapy, it acknowledges that Leary's early work sits near the beginning of a longer and more complicated story, one in which these substances were once treated as serious objects of psychological attention, before later becoming engulfed by backlash and moral panic. And it's here that I think that the human part of the story becomes more visible. So beneath the institutional details lies a deeper hunger. The 20th century had given people many ways to explain themselves, but not many ways to feel transformed. Psychology could classify. Religion for many had weakened. Modern life was increasingly rational, procedural, administered. And then along comes the possibility, or at least the rumour, that consciousness might be cracked open directly. not analysed from the outside, but encountered from within, experienced in an afternoon. Now you can see why that would fascinate someone like Leary. You can also see why it would tempt him. There's a profound difference between studying the mind and being seduced by it. A profound difference between research and revelation. At first, the difference can be hard to detect because it's precisely the intensity of the experience that convinces the experiencer they've touched something more real than ordinary thought. Leary was hardly unique in this. Many people who encounter a dramatic inner event feel they've not merely learned something but been chosen by it. And once that feeling arrives, detachment becomes difficult. Still, in this phase, the story remains open. It's too early to flatten it into a cautionary tale. There was genuine curiosity here, genuine experimentation, genuine uncertainty. The Harvard psilocybin project did not begin as a cartoon. It was a question that remains alive even now. What if human consciousness is stranger, deeper, and more transformable than our institutions know how to admit? That question is part of what made Leary compelling. He wasn't merely chasing sensation, at least not at first. He seemed to be pushing against the limits of what respectable knowledge allowed itself to ask. He stood at a threshold between clinical psychology and mystical possibility, between the lab and the sacrament, between disciplined inquiry and something far more volatile. That threshold is what makes him historically significant, and it's also what makes him dangerous. Because once a person begins to believe they have found a hidden key to the human condition, they rarely remain content with modest claims. And so the fault line begins, not with the slogans or the celebrity, not with the public spectacle that will come to define him. It begins in the quieter moment, like all things do, the almost respectable moment, when a Harvard psychologist returns from Mexico convinced that the mind has doors most people have never even noticed, and that he may have glimpsed the handle. This is where we start, with a serious man standing at the edge of a serious question, and with the first hint that the question may be larger than the man asking it. At the beginning of a story like this, it's still possible to believe that curiosity will remain curiosity, that the institution will hold, that the research will stay research, that a new frontier can be explored with enough seriousness, enough caution, and enough intellectual discipline that the whole thing doesn't collapse into spectacle. For a brief moment, that seems to have been the hope around Timothy Leary and the work he began at Harvard. But this is where that hope starts to come apart. Because the problem with thresholds is that they don't always stay thresholds. Sometimes they become invitations, sometimes temptations, and sometimes, if the people standing near them are charismatic enough, hungry enough, or convinced enough of what they've found, they stop becoming places of inquiry and start becoming stages. That is what begins to happen here. The Harvard psilocybin project, launched by Leary and Alpert in 1960, didn't initially present itself as a joke or a rebellion. It was framed as an attempt to explore the effects of psilocybin on consciousness, and in that sense it emerged out of a genuine psychological question. Harvard's own departmental history still presents it in that light, noting that Leary and Alpert saw psychotropic substances as relevant to the study of the mind, its relationship to the body, and the human environment. But that same history also tells you exactly where the neat story begins to fracture. The early experiments involved volunteer graduate students who were not always fully informed, and concerns began to mount over both the legitimacy and the safety of the work. Here, drink this tea. Will I be all right? No, it's full of LSD. Now this is where things get a little bit more interesting. Because on one level, what Leary was pursuing spoke to something that respectable psychology still struggles with. There are dimensions of human experience that do not fit neatly inside behaviorist charts or clinical categories. Mystical states, ego dissolution, intensified perception, the feeling that the self can be loosened or even temporarily dissolved. These are not trivial experiences, even if they are difficult to measure. You can understand why a psychologist might become obsessed with that terrain. And you can understand why the old tools might begin to feel a bit too blunt, too procedural, too small for what he believed he'd stumbled into. But understanding that is not the same as excusing what came next. The deeper Leary moved into psychedelic experience, the harder it seems to have become for him to maintain the distance that serious inquiry requires. The researcher and the convert begin to blur. The scientist and the evangelist start sharing the same body. And once that happens, something subtle but important changes. A question stops becoming something you investigate and becomes something you proclaim. That shift rarely feels dangerous from the inside. From the inside, it can feel like conviction, it can feel like courage, like finally saying aloud what other people are too timid to admit. But from the outside, especially inside an institution like Harvard, it begins to look like a loss of discipline, a loss of boundaries, and a loss of trust. And boundaries were becoming a problem. The university had already tried to impose conditions on the work. Leary and Alpert agreed to policies designed to protect subjects, including a prohibition on the participation of undergraduate students. That alone tells you something important. Even at this relatively early stage, the institution sensed risk. It sensed that the frontier they were approaching was not just intellectually interesting, but ethically volatile. Then, in the spring of 1963, Richard Alpert administered psilocybin to an undergraduate student off campus. Naughty Baba Ramdas. Harvard dismissed him. Leary was also removed, and the project came to an abrupt end. Now, the details around Leary's own dismissal have always carried a slightly murky edge, which is fitting really, because that ambiguity tells you something about the whole atmosphere surrounding him. One account notes that he was dismissed in 1963 alongside Alpert and connects the scandal in part to the exposure of drug use among undergraduates. Other accounts note that Harvard formally cited Leary's failure to keep classroom appointments and absences from Cambridge during term time. Both things can be true at once, obviously. Institutions often prefer tidy administrative language when dealing with a messier moral panic. The public record may say one thing, but the deeper reason may be larger. And larger is exactly what this had become. What began as a controversial research effort was now spilling beyond the controlled space of academic inquiry. It was leaking into private sessions, into campus culture, into rumour, reputation and scandal. The problem was no longer simply whether psilocybin had something meaningful to reveal. The problem was whether Leary and Alpert had become incapable of holding the line between discovery and persuasion, between exploration and recruitment. Now that distinction is important because any transformative experience creates a subtle form of authority in the person who has had it. They come back speaking differently, seeing differently, certain that something has been touched that ordinary language can't quite contain. That certainty can be moving, and it can also be contagious. And once it becomes contagious, a new danger appears. The experience begins to generate a social orbit around itself. People gather, a mood forms, a sense of shared initiation develops. The language gets grander, the claims get larger. What was once a method becomes a worldview. Leary was extraordinarily vulnerable to that drift, perhaps because he also seems to have been extraordinarily gifted at it. He wasn't just intelligent, he was theatrical. He had a public instinct, a flair for making ideas feel charged, transgressive and liberating. Those qualities can be magnetic, but they can also be corrosive inside any discipline that depends on restraint. What made him culturally potent may have been exactly what made him academically unsustainable. Now this is where the shadow side of the early psychedelic story really begins to emerge. The promise wasn't false, at least not entirely. Even now, serious institutions are again studying psychedelics for depression, trauma, addiction, and end-of-life distress. Harvard Medical School has written about the renewed legitimacy of psychedelic therapy and the modern attempt to recover careful, evidence-based approaches to substances that were once pushed to the fringes. That modern return's important because it reminds us that Leary wasn't wrong simply because he was interested in altered states. The deeper issue was how quickly interest became advocacy, and advocacy became cultural combustion. And that is the contradiction at the heart of this story. Leary may have glimpsed a real frontier. He may have helped reveal that consciousness is not nearly as fixed or as transparent as conventional psychology once preferred to believe. But he also seems to have lacked the temperament, or perhaps the humility, to remain merely a guide to that frontier. He wanted more than discovery. He wanted transformation, drama, consequence. He wanted the thing to matter in a larger register. And once that desire enters the room itself changes. Now this is where the fabric begins to fray. Not because the world misunderstood a brave researcher, not because a stodgy institution crushed a truth teller. Those versions are far too easy and clean and flattering to whichever side you happen to prefer. The real story is harder. It's that something potentially serious was passing through the hands of people who were becoming less and less capable of handling it soberly in every sense of the word. And once that happens, the ground shifts. The university falls away, the discipline falls away. The old language of research starts to feel too small for the appetite that's now been awakened. What remains is not yet the full cultural circus that Timothy Leary will become, but the tent poles are already in the ground. There comes a point in certain lives where the person disappears into the symbol. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic instant, more like a slow takeover. The individual becomes less important than the story other people need them to carry. Their face hardens into an emblem, their words flatten into slogans, their contradictions no longer treated as contradictions at all, but either polished into sainthood or weaponized into proof that they were a fraud from the beginning. Now by now, Timothy Leary is no longer just a former Harvard psychologist who crossed an academic line. He's becoming something much larger and much less stable. A public prophet of altered consciousness, a celebrity of transcendence, a figure who no longer belongs to the measured language of research, but to the much hotter language of cultural rebellion. He's described quite plainly as a leading advocate for LSD and other psychoactive drugs, and by the late 1960s that advocacy had placed him at the very centre of the American counterculture. Once Leary leaves the university behind, he doesn't retreat into private reflection or quieter scholarship. He moves in the opposite direction. He moves towards theatre, towards symbol, toward a more total public identity. One of the most important spaces in this transformation was Millbrook, the sprawling estate in upstate New York, where Leary and his circle continued psychedelic sessions after the Harvard years. The New York Public Library's archival record and other historical accounts describe this period as the phase in which Leary moved from being an academic investigator into the nucleus of a far looser and more mythologized experiment in communal consciousness. It's there that the idea stops being merely studied and starts being lived and performed and embodied as a way of life. And perhaps that's always the danger with revelations of this kind. A private insight can remain subtle, it can remain difficult, ambiguous, inward. But once it becomes collective, once a group gathers around it, once it starts generating language, ritual, style, expectation, then something changes. The experience is no longer just an experience. It becomes a social identity, a mood, a scene, a mythology people can enter. Leary was made for that transformation. He had the rare and combustible combination of intelligence and showmanship. He didn't simply want to describe altered consciousness. He wanted to announce it, to package it, to fling it into the bloodstream of a culture already restless, already suspicious of institutions, already hungry for a life that felt less cold and bureaucratic than the post-war consensus had promised. The 1960s counterculture was full of this hunger. Communal living, anti-war protest, anti-authoritarianism, spiritual experimentation, new forms of music and dress, new forms of speech, and a profound distrust of the old social script. Leary fit that world almost too well. He gave it a vocabulary for its own desire to break the frame. Now you may have heard this slogan, turn on, tune in, drop out. It's remembered now almost like a cartoon of the era. But those slogans always tell you something about the age that adopts them. Contemporary historical records and later accounts place the phrase in the mid-1960s and connect it to Leary's growing role as the most recognizable public salesman of psychedelic transformation. Whether one hears it as liberation or abdication, the phrase itself marks a decisive shift. The vocabulary of inquiry has now become replaced by the vocabulary of invitation. The scientist has become the herald, the researcher has become the brand. And this is where we get a little bit more existential. So what does dropout actually mean when spoken into a culture already splitting at the seams? What does it mean to tell people to detach from the social order when that order includes not only conformity and bureaucracy, but also responsibility, continuity, and the ordinary disciplines that keep a person tethered to reality? This is the shadow that now begins to deepen around Leary. He's no longer merely asking whether psychedelics can expand consciousness. He's helping construct a whole atmosphere in which intensity begins to stand in for wisdom and rupture begins to stand in for growth. There's something intoxicating about that, even without the drugs. The idea that one could step outside the script, exit the machine, refuse the dead language of institutions and be reborn into something freer, more real, more immediate. That fantasy didn't begin with Leary, of course. It's ancient. Mystical traditions, revolutionary movements, apocalyptic sects, romantic artists, all of them in their own ways have dreamed of breaking through the surface of ordinary life into some truer order. What Leary did was fuse that ancient longing to the media logic of modern celebrity and the pharmacology of psychedelic experience. He made transcendence look public, replicable, portable, marketable. And that may be the precise moment that things begin to rot. Because the search for transcendence cannot survive unchanged once it's absorbed into spectacle. Spectacle feeds on simplification. It rewards confidence, certainty, visibility. It doesn't reward discipline, patience, ambiguity, or the slow and often humiliating work of integrating what we've seen. A culture can sell ecstasy much more easily than it can sell responsibility. And no, I'm not talking about the happy pills. It can sell rebellion much more easily than it can sell discernment. So Leary becomes larger and hollower at the same time. He founds the League for Spiritual Discovery, an organisation that treated LSD as a holy sacrament and attempted, at least in part, to frame psychedelic use through the language of religion. On one level, you can see the logic. If the experience feels sacred, why not say so openly? Why not admit that the old categories of psychology are too thin for what's happening? But on another level, this move reveals just how far the story has drifted from the institutional caution of the early Harvard period. The frontier is now not only scientific or therapeutic, it's spiritual, political, and theatrical all at once. The centre doesn't hold because there's no bloody centre anymore. And the state responds in the way states often do when spectacle and fear begin feeding one another. Leary is repeatedly arrested on drug charges across the 1960s. The legal pressure intensifies, the public image darkens. Richard Nixon would later refer to him as the most dangerous man in America, which sounds absurd if taken literally, and yet deeply revealing if taken symbolically. Leary had become the face of a threat that was not just chemical but cultural. He represented a loosening, a refusal, a kind of psychic insubordination. Then comes the prison sentence, and from there the story almost leaves history and enters into folklore. After a long legal struggle following marijuana arrests in 1965 and 1968, Leary was incarcerated in 1970. Then, in one of those moments that makes the whole period feel half political and half hallucinatory, the Weather Underground helped him escape. He fled first to Algeria and later to Afghanistan, where he was captured in 1973 and returned to a California prison. Just listen to that sequence slowly and it starts to sound less like a biography than like the fever dream of an era consuming itself. Revolutionaries helping a psychedelic guru break out of prison so that he can drift through international exile before being dragged back into the machinery of the state. This is not a neat arc of enlightenment. This is cultural delirium. And this, I think, is where the crisis of the whole story really hits. It's not simply that Leary fell from academic legitimacy, not simply that he became controversial or reckless or famous. It's that the very thing he seemed to be offering, liberation from the deadening structures of ordinary consciousness, became inseparable from a growing atmosphere of confusion, excess, projection, and collapse. The man who'd once stood at the edge of a serious question now seems to be swallowed by the consequences of asking it without restraint. A culture can only worship dissolution for so long before something begins to dissolve for real. And perhaps that's the darkest truth hiding inside Leary's rise to fame. The problem was never just the drugs. It was the fantasy attached to them, the fantasy that revelation is enough, the fantasy that intensity is transformation, the fantasy that breaking out is the same as becoming free. By now, the idea has eaten the man. What remains is a public symbol moving through the wreckage of his own significance, still promising expansion, still radiating possibility, but increasingly unable to distinguish between consciousness as a frontier and consciousness as a stage. And once that distinction is lost, the collapse is already underway. There's a temptation, after a figure like Timothy Leary has passed through scandal, exile, prison, celebrity and collapse, to force a verdict, to decide at last what he was. Visionary or fraud, prophet or clown, a man ahead of his time or a man who helped derail something valuable before it had the chance to mature. We like verdicts because they spare us the harder task of thinking. They turn contradiction into closure. They let us put a lid on the mess and move on. But that kind of certainty starts to feel cheap. What emerges from the wreckage of Leary's life is not a clean moral and certainly not a comfortable one. What emerges is something more difficult than judgment. It's the recognition that Leary was carrying a real question inside a deeply unstable answer. And this is why his ideas, his kind of presence still persists. It's not because everything he touched turned to truth. Much of it didn't. And it's not because the cultural circus around him was secretly wisdom in disguise. Much of it plainly wasn't either. But because beneath the ego, beneath the spectacle, beneath the slogans and the chaos and the messianic overreach, there was still a question that hasn't gone away. What exactly happens when consciousness changes? What do altered states reveal, if anything? And perhaps most importantly, what is the difference between having a profound experience and becoming a transformed human being? Now, I think the difference is the revelation. And it's a larger revelation than Leary himself might have ever fully grasped. One of the things history has done, quietly and a little ironically, is preserve part of his legacy while stripping away much of his theatre. The modern revival of psychedelic research hasn't returned to Timothy Leary as a prophet. It's returned more cautiously to some of the questions he helped drag into view. Institutions are now studying psychedelics in controlled settings for depression, trauma, addiction, and end-of-life distress. In other words, the respectable world didn't permanently bury the frontier. It came back to it, but with tighter ethics, stricter methods, and a far less tolerance for charismatic chaos. That alone should tell you something revealing. Leary wasn't simply wrong because he believed altered states mattered. In some sense, he was early to a real conversation. But being early to a conversation isn't the same as being wise about it. A person can touch a true thing and still distort it in the telling. They can stand near an important doorway and still become intoxicated by the fact that they were the ones seen standing there. And perhaps that's exactly what happened. One of the concepts still associated with Leary and his collaborators is set and setting. The idea that the quality of a psychedelic experience is shaped not just by the substance itself, but by the user's mindset, expectations, intentions, and surrounding environment. That concept has endured because it contains something plainly serious. It reminds us that consciousness is not a machine with a single predictable output. Context matters, character matters, atmosphere matters. The mind does not enter these states as a blank instrument, it brings itself along. Now, set and setting isn't only a psychedelic principle, it's almost a principle of being human. We don't meet experience neutrally, we bring fear to it, hunger to it, shame to it, longing to it. We bring our private myths, our hidden wounds, our need to be special, our wish to be healed, our desire to escape, our half-conscious hope that one overwhelming moment might spare us the slower labour of change. So when Leary preached expansion, what exactly was being expanded? Sometimes insight, perhaps. Sometimes wonder. Sometimes a temporary loosening of the self that allowed people to see their own patterns with unusual clarity. But also at times, grandiosity, suggestibility, chaos, fantasy. The need to belong to something ecstatic and absolute. If the self goes into the experience fractured, hungry or inflated, then those qualities don't magically vanish just because the experience feels sacred. They may return dressed in more luminous clothing. That's the insight that arrives sideways. The problem was never that transcendence is meaningless. The problem is that transcendence doesn't exempt a person from psychology. It doesn't cancel ego. It doesn't dissolve the ordinary disciplines of honesty, restraint, humility, and integration. A revelation may show you something. It may even show you something true. But if you don't know how to live in relation to that truth, then the revelation can become just another possession of the self, another ornament, another story about why you're different, another method of avoiding the difficult and unspectacular work of becoming accountable for your own life. And Leary, for all his brilliance and cultural force, seems to embody that failure of integration. He helped popularize the search for altered consciousness, but he also helped fuse that search to performance. He made interior experience public theatre. He made the language of awakening easy to market and difficult to interrogate. The media, of course, loved him for it, and the state feared him for it. But both reactions fed the same machine. The more he was treated as symbol, the less room there was for sobriety in the deepest sense. Not chemical sobriety, but moral and psychological sobriety. The ability to ask not just what an experience felt like, but what it asked of you afterwards. Now that question is where Leary's story starts becoming uncomfortably modern. Ours is still a culture obsessed with altered states, sometimes chemical ones, sometimes digital ones, sometimes spiritual ones. Even, every now and then, we like to have emotional ones. We chase intensity everywhere, through productivity, through relationships, am I getting a lisp? Through relationships, through self-help, through ideology, through doom scrolling and optimization and identity and endless reinvention. We're still looking for that breakthrough that will rearrange us. We're still seduced by experiences that promise escape from the ordinary burden of being a person with limitations, obligations, contradictions, and all the shit that comes with it. And when we do that, we often repeat Leary's mistake in miniature. We confuse access with arrival. We confuse seeing with becoming. We confuse a cracked open moment with a transformed life. But a life is not changed by intensity alone. It is changed by what can be carried back from intensity into the difficult structure of an ordinary weekday, into how one speaks, how one loves, how one works, how one bears frustration, how one resists the urge to turn every powerful experience into a private myth of exceptionalism. That is the revelation waiting inside the collapse. Leary is important not because he solved the mystery of consciousness and not because he can be dismissed as a flamboyant error. He's important because he exposes a fracture that still runs through every search for liberation. The fracture between awakening and integration, between experience and character, between touching the edge of something vast and learning how, or whether, to come back from it changed in a way that makes you more human rather than less. And perhaps that is the hardest truth of all. The self does not become free simply because it has briefly disappeared. Sometimes it returns more enchanted with itself than ever. In the end, what remains of a figure like Timothy Leary is not just the controversy or the slogans, or even the strange historical glow that still hangs around the 1960s whenever people start talking about psychedelics, rebellion, and the expansion of consciousness. Pass me the spliff, mate. What remains? What remains is a question. Not the question Leary thought he was answering necessarily, but the one his life leaves behind. What are we really looking for when we say we want freedom? What do we mean when we talk about awakening, transformation, transcendence, breaking out of ourselves? And what part of that longing is genuine depth? And what part of it is simply exhaustion with the ordinary burden of being alive? Because we all know that that burden's a real one. It's not dramatic enough for slogans, which is perhaps why people so often try to escape it. But it's real all the same. To be a person is to be limited, to have a mind that can deceive you, to carry memory, shame, fear, fantasy, contradiction, to be split between what you say you value and what you actually do, to keep hoping, often against all evidence, that somewhere there exists an experience, a practice, a revelation, a person, a breakthrough that will make the whole thing less difficult. And that's why I think Leary continues to feel strangely relevant. It's not because most people are trying to recreate the psychedelic utopianism of the 1960s, although I did drop 5 milligrams of LSD before this episode. They are not. I didn't really. But because, do you think I could read a script on that? But because the structure, it's all hexagons. I've just been staring at a plate for 30 minutes. But because the structure of, I've lost it again. Let me start that again. But because the structure of the longing remains familiar, we still live in a culture full of promises of transformation. Some of them are chemical, some technological, some spiritual, some therapeutic, some political, some aesthetic. But they often whisper the same thing in different accents. You do not need to stay as you are. There is another level, another state, another version of yourself waiting just beyond the threshold. The promise is powerful because it's not entirely false. People do change. Consciousness does shift. Certain experiences really can alter the shape of a life. Suffering can soften, perspective can widen, old patterns can loosen. It'd be dishonest to deny that. The human being is not a sealed container. We are porous, we are changeable. Sometimes a single experience does pierce straight through the fog and reveal something that years of ordinary living had concealed. But revelation is not redemption. And that perhaps is the sentence Leary's life circles without ever quite settling into. To see something clearly, even something profound, is not the same as being remade by it in a stable and humane way. To have the boundaries of the self temporarily dissolve is not the same as learning how to live without being ruled by that self. To touch mystery is not the same as becoming wise. There's no shortage of people who have had extraordinary experiences and remained deeply confused, deeply self-deceived, and deeply chaotic. In some cases, the extraordinary experience only gives their confusion a more glamorous vocabulary. This is the grounds that we land on. It's not cynical, it's not dismissive, but hopefully slightly firmer. Because if Leary's life shows us anything, it's that the search for liberation needs something stronger than appetite, stronger than novelty, stronger than charisma. It needs a container. It needs ethics. It needs humility. It needs the willingness to come back down from the mountain or the trip or the vision and ask the less glamorous question. What now? What do I do with what I've seen? How does it change the way I treat people? How does it change the stories I tell myself? How does it affect my relationship to power, to desire, to pain, to truth? And can I carry any of it into ordinary life without turning it into theatre? These are not ecstatic questions, but they may be the only ones that matter in the long run. The ordinary life, the one so many people spend so much energy trying to transcend, is also the place where every spiritual or psychological claim is tested. It's not in the peak moment itself, but afterwards, in the kitchen, in the conversation, in disappointment, in frustration, in repetition, in whether you become less cruel, less performative, less addicted to being special, in whether your search for freedom makes you more present or merely less available to reality. And this is where you come back into the frame, my friends, because it would be easy to leave Timothy Leary safely in the past, to treat him as one of those vivid historical curiosities who appear whenever an age becomes intoxicated with its own hunger for change. But that would let us off too lightly, wouldn't it? The more uncomfortable truth is that many of us live by our own versions of turn on, tune in and drop out, even if we don't say the words. We do it when we chase intensity instead of integration. We do it when we collect insights but avoid discipline. We do it when we mistake self-expansion for self-understanding. We do it when we treat every strong feeling as a revelation and every difficult limit as something to be bypassed rather than examined. And we do it when we keep trying to leave ourselves without ever really meeting ourselves. Timothy Leary wasn't just a man of his era. He was an exaggerated version of a temptation that belongs to all eras. The temptation to believe that freedom lies somewhere outside the ordinary conditions of human life, outside discipline, outside responsibility, outside the slow work of knowing one's own mind, and believe me, that is fucking slow work. outside the difficult fact that no experience, however astonishing, can absolve a person of the task of becoming accountable for who they are. But there's of course another way to hear the whole story. Not as a warning against altered states, not as a reactionary plea for dullness, conformity or fear, but as a reminder that any genuine expansion of consciousness must eventually return to character. It must return to form, to relationship, to the daily world in which insight either deepens into wisdom or evaporates into story. Maybe that's the real distinction, not between the ordinary and the transcendent, but between what merely dazzles us and what actually changes how we live. Leary dazzled. By fuck did he dazzle. There's no use pretending otherwise. He dazzled a culture, he dazzled himself. Couldn't even look in the mirror, he was so dazzled. He helped make the inner world feel larger, stranger, more open to experiment than many people had previously imagined. That's part of his legacy, and it shouldn't be dismissed just because he became tangled in his own performance and collapse. But dazzling is not enough. In the end, we are left with something quieter than a slogan and harder than a verdict. A question about freedom stripped of fantasy. A question about whether the life we're trying to escape is actually the life we're being asked to inhabit more fully, more honestly, more consciously. Sometimes, the deepest form of liberation is not leaving the self behind. It's returning to it without illusion and learning, slowly, to live there. We began with the promise of escape, with the seductive idea that somewhere beyond the ordinary mind, beyond the routines and burdens of everyday consciousness, there might be a doorway into something larger, something freer, something truer. And Timothy Leary, for a certain moment in history, seemed to stand in that doorway and call others towards it. That's what made him powerful, but it's also what made him dangerous. Leary's life doesn't finally leave us with a clean instruction. It doesn't tell us to reject transcendence, and it doesn't tell us to worship it. It leaves us with a more difficult recognition than either of those. That the search for liberation can reveal something real and still go badly wrong. That an experience can feel sacred and still be distorted by ego. That a person can glimpse a meaningful truth and yet fail to build a life around it with humility, care, and responsibility. And maybe that is why his story still lingers on. Not because he belongs only to the 1960s, and not because psychedelics are the whole point, they certainly aren't. The deeper point is that Leary gives us a dramatic version of a temptation that remains deeply human. The temptation to believe that freedom is elsewhere, in a breakthrough, in a revelation, in a heightened state, in some extraordinary moment that will rescue us from the slower, quieter, and less glamorous work of becoming conscious in ordinary life. But ordinary life is where everything is tested. Not in the flash of insight itself, but in what remains when the light recedes. In how we speak, in how we treat other people, in whether we become more honest or simply more enchanted by our own sense of specialness, in whether what we call awakening actually deepens our humanity or merely gives us a more impressive story to tell about ourselves. That, I think, is the final weight of Timothy Leary. He reminds us that consciousness is not a toy, not a slogan, not a stage. It is vast, unstable, mysterious, and powerful. It can open us. It can disorient us. It can show us something we needed to see. But whatever we encounter there, however extraordinary it may feel, we still have to come back into relationship, back into limitation, back into the unfinished task of being a person. So perhaps the question left hanging at the end of all of this isn't whether we should seek freedom. It's what kind of freedom we are actually seeking. The kind that dazzles us for a moment then disappears, or the kind that asks us to live more truthfully when the moment is over. Because the mind has many doorways, but not every doorway leads us home. Thank you, you beautiful lot, for tuning in today. Your time, your presence, your attention are, as always, deeply appreciated. If you want to keep wandering through this philosophical wreckage with me, if you can tolerate my screaming into the void, you can find the show in all the usual digital purgatories. We're on TikTok, Instagram, and X with the handle at The Observing Eye. We are on YouTube at youtube.com/@theobservingeye. And we are on Substack, which is the home of the podcast, at theobservingeye.com. And of course, you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever platform you use to deliver these sensory wonders into your ears. Oi. Oi, put it in your ears. You can also, fuck's sake, you can also drop me an email after all that at david@theobservingeye.com. I do read them, and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. So if you want to recommend a subject for an episode, or you just want to say hi, or want to wax philosophical about something, feel free to send me a message. We will be back next week. Our hiatus is over. We are continuing our Realm of the Psychonaut season with the Mushroom King himself, Terence McKenna. Until then, take care everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.